Venezuelan people decide for themselves. But let me welcome out of New York, Latin American expert, Mr. Daniel Shah. Thank you so much for being with us. What, in your perspective, is the United States after in Venezuela?
Well, ever since 1999, when Hugo Chavez won the elections in Venezuela, the U.S. government has had a bone to pick because the new government came in with a new social mission and a new economic mission, which was genuine self-determination for the Venezuelan people and for all of Latin America and the Caribbean. So Trump just announced this past week the 5th round of sanctions that he's slapping on Venezuela, and it's an attempt at regime change, which is synonymous with recolonization. I really think that an American audience should be questioning where Trump lines up on this issue. If Trump is so fervently anti-Bolivarian and anti-Nicolas Maduro, why would liberals here at home or other open-minded people line up on the same side as Trump? Trump cannot be pro-fascist and pro-white supremacist in the United States and be anything different abroad.
Our guest in Norfolk, I don't know if you heard us, had joined us at that point in time, Daniel, but our guest in Norfolk said that basically the Maduro government is a corrupt government and actually should not be in power because the elections were not legitimate. What would you say to that?
In response to that, that same line is parroted every day on Fox News and CNN and the entire gamut of the mainstream media in the United States. The United States and the quote-unquote international community never had a problem with centuries of corruption and centuries of authoritarianism in Venezuela until 1999. When Hugo Chavez wins and later on the process is spearheaded by Nicolas Maduro, suddenly Amnesty International and the human rights organizations and both the liberals and the conservatives in the U.S. have a huge problem with Venezuela. While they ignore the systematic assassinations of union leaders and journalists in Mexico, while they ignore the same thing in Colombia and across Latin America, they focus the microscope on Venezuela, but it's really a political and economic difference with Venezuela, and they've bamboozled the American people, unfortunately.
Well, Frederick Peterson, Washington has a very dark history of intervention in Latin America. Why is that the case?
You're making that as an assumption that I'm supposed to agree with, and then we discuss why that assumption is correct.
Well, we can list the countries if you want. It's not an assumption, it's actual reality, but you go ahead and give your perspective on the question.
That the assumption is fundamentally flawed. The United States has not exported that throughout Latin America. In fact, much of Latin America is liberal democracy as a result of the influence of the United States. And there are very few who leave the United States and flee the United States seeking refuge in people's republics anywhere, be that in Cuba, where people were dying to get out, certainly not dying to get in. Close friends, Fidel and Chavez, with Venezuela. People are dying literally to get out.
Well, it's interesting you made that point. I mean, if we go back, we can go back to the 70s, starting from Chile and Pinochet, or we can go to El Salvador, we can go to Nicaragua, or we can go to Venezuela today. So there is a history, whether you want to agree with it or not. And as far as people getting in and out, I mean, we look at the literacy rate in actually a place like Cuba, which is actually higher than your United States. But turning to Daniel Shah, President Maduro, commenting on demonstrations in the past, has said that they were orchestrated by the Americans along with economic pressure. Now, I want to look at this because people, perhaps like Frederick Peterson, would say that actually it's the people rising up. But I want to look at, we know from books from economic hitmen and exactly how the United States gets in and manipulates the economy, puts the pressure on the people so they will go on the street. And now we see even sanctions. Actually, now Donald Trump has gone to actually levying sanctions against Venezuela.
We should really look closely at the nature of these protests in Venezuela because, again, I think an American audience has severely misunderstood where these protests are based. The protests are based in the richest, whitest, most privileged communities of Caracas, in Chacao and Altamira, among the most elite and the light-skinned individuals who really inherited their privilege from centuries of colonialism. Of course, racism being a staple of colonialism throughout Latin America. So it's very deceptive when on CNN or whatever U.S. media channel you see these protests that are extremely racist. They've actually lynched individuals in the streets of Caracas and across Venezuela. And to really identify the class character of these protests, these are individuals that are anti-democratic, anti-human rights, and they're against the Maduro government because the Maduro government has stood up against speculation, against the hoarders, against the rule of the 1% in Venezuela. And I'm glad that the host brought up Chile 1973, and Grenada 1979, and Nicaragua 1979, Panama 1989. There's such a long history of U.S. interventionism that anybody with a conscience should really be questioning how can they line up on the same side as Donald Trump and the U.S. government in this debate.
Well, what about that? Go ahead, Frederick Peterson, let me get you back in on this. Your take on all of this. It appears that with Venezuela, we look at, there was a call by Maduro for maneuvers, and 800,000 people, just volunteers, showed up. Almost 1 million people right now are participating in the maneuvers. Do you think that that shows any type of support from the grassroots there in Venezuela?
No, absolutely not. What were they given? A free burrito, which they couldn't afford otherwise because they're starving to death? No, that is an utter sham. And to even look at that with a minuscule of knowledge about what is really happening down there, who is perpetrating the atrocities on their own people, who is enslaving their own people with an economic system that wherever it has been imposed, it has been imposed not by a vote, but by a gun and a bayonet. And we have the people who are in the street, whether they're white, brown, black, pink, purple, or whatever hue they might be, these are people who are Venezuelans. These are people who are the most productive in Venezuela. Productive, I mean producing more than they consume and returning it to the rest. What we have is a Maduro government that carries on the tradition of Chavez, which carries on the tradition of Fidel Castro. No one is fleeing the freedom of any of their neighbors to find solace and prosperity and peace within Maduro's Hitler-esque government or within Fidel Castro's Cuba. And it remains as Fidel Castro's Cuba, with his fingerprints, shall we say, boot prints, still firmly implanted on the back of the citizens there. No, people do not flee to that system, they flee from it.
What about that Daniel Shaw? He talked about, our guest in Norfolk, talked about Chavez's Venezuela, which we know how Hugo Chavez actually changed the economic reality for millions of poor people in Venezuela. And of course, since his death, and even before his death, we have seen attempt after attempt of trying to sabotage the Venezuelan economy out of the U.S. Your take on what our guest has said?
Well, for Colonel Peterson to compare Maduro or Chavez or Fidel Castro to Adolf Hitler is extremely dishonest, and it's really an extremist statement that's quite frightening. These individuals represented the interests of the vast majority, the 99% of people across Latin America, and that's why they earned the scorn and the hatred and the enmity of their enemies in Washington and in Miami, because they stood up for a dignified Latin America. We do have to focus on the poverty, the scarcity. There's a very difficult situation in Caracas. We don't dispute that part of it. What we disagree with Colonel Peterson on is who is ultimately behind this scarcity and this humanitarian crisis. Because yes, throngs of Venezuelan families are leaving in the thousands, but let's question why. Because it's U.S.-backed, international-backed, and it's not just the U.S. by itself, but an entire international community, quote-unquote community, the IMF and the World Bank and the city banks, who are working together in collusion to make sure that the bolivar, the Venezuelan currency, is worth nothing. One day it's worth 17,000 bolivares is worth $1 US. The next day it's 10,000 bolivares. This speculation is out of control. So the Venezuelan families are caught up in this horrific reality of outside interventionism. It's a five-pronged attack. It's a media offensive, a diplomatic offensive, a military offensive, and an economic offensive. It's the same thing they did to Cuba for decades and decades, but it was especially acute in the 1990s during the special period. And I don't want to say that Cuba is an exact comparison to Venezuela, but Venezuela is living through what Cuba lived through in the 1990s. It's a special period. So the strategy of imperialism is to provoke a crisis so they can then turn around and say, well, we have to intervene for human rights. We have to intervene for the Venezuelan people. But of course, they're trying to deceive us once again with their machinations.
Are you optimistic, 30 seconds, Frederick Peterson, that the Venezuelan people will ride this out successfully? How do you see it? 30 seconds.
If the Venezuelan people had an opportunity, they would welcome with flowers and cheers in the street Americans coming to rescue them from the oblivion which the communist government of Maduro and its predecessor has consigned them. There is no government in the history of the world that has become communist that has improved the lives of its people.
Okay.
It has dragged them down to moral and financial degradation.
All right,
That's what's
and 30
happening there.
seconds, Daniel Shaw. 30 seconds. Do you think that the Venezuelan people can survive what they're going through? Go ahead.
Colonel Peterson would surely say the same thing about the Vietnamese people and the Iraqi people, that they welcomed the U.S. invasions, which were genocidal invasions and occupations. The U.S. ruling class has Venezuela also in their vision. They want to do the same thing to Venezuela. Here in the United States, we have a responsibility in the anti-war movement with the People's Congress of Resistance to stand up for the sovereignty of Venezuela, of North Korea, of Iran, of Syria, of every country that's under both overt and covert attack from the U.S. government.
All right, and on that note, so sorry we're out of time. I appreciate both of you being with us. Daniel Shaw out of New York, Latin American expert, and Frederick Peterson out of Norfolk, Virginia, senior U.S. Congressional Defense Advisor. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marcia Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew. See you next time. Bye.